But we talked about those blessings last week. We also looked at some of those indications of, the concepts of the Messiah, son of Joseph, the suffering servant, the Messiah, son of David, the conquering king. We looked at the origins, or some of the origins of those things in last week's Torah portion at the end of the book of Genesis. I even shared for a little while about, from the Aramaic translations, about how the reasons why all the tribes identified themselves as Jews. And it's a different reason than what we think of most of today, and what we mostly hear argued. But Genesis, it ends with things generally going relatively well for Jacob's family in Egypt. And it ends with this prophecy about their time in Egypt, how at some point their time in Egypt is going to end. So chapter 50, verse 24, puts it like this. It says, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely take notice of you and will bring you up from this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." It says, "Then Joseph made Israel's sons swear an oath, saying, 'When God takes notice of you, you will bring my bones up from here.'" And so Joseph died at 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So he knows that they're going to leave someday. And he knows that when they go, they're going to be able to, or he's going to insist that they take him with him. Because he does not want to stay out there in Egypt when the promise is back in the land. He doesn't want to stay and remain outside that promise. It's almost as if he doesn't want to wait till the resurrection to get there. He wants to get there as quickly as he can. Even if he's dead and gone, he still wants to get there as soon as possible. And that's a wonderful attitude to have. And notice when Joseph, he talks about this prophecy, Joseph does not mention, there is no description of how bad it has to get before that happens. For Jacob's sons, again, everything is generally going well at that point. And it might be hard for them to think how things can change. It might be hard for them to understand how things can go from being so well and so good to being so bad. It may be hard for them to think how quickly that can happen. Maybe they remember what was told to Abraham back in Genesis 15, but I kind of suspect that that warning was forgotten. In Genesis 15, God is speaking to Abram. He says, "Know for certain that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed." Those are not positive words, are they? Enslaved and oppressed 400 years. "But I am going to judge the nation that they will serve. Afterward, they will go out with many possessions." Maybe they forgot this part. But the generation of Joseph and the family going down into Egypt, something about that made me think. It seems like it's almost like an equivalent to the generation that essentially won the Revolutionary War, won and ratified the Constitution of the United States, because things were generally looking up, right? Things were getting better. And it's hard for them to look just a few hundred years ahead to see how bad things can get. Maybe we had forgotten the warnings that they gave in their day. But what would have to happen to get the Israelites who, at this time, when Joseph is there, and for a while after that, what would it take to get those Israelites, who are some of the most successful in Egypt, to get them into slavery? And in the same way, what would it have to happen to get this nation that was born in freedom, based on a godly foundation, to abandon that freedom, as in many ways we are on the verge of doing? Lots of things have to happen. And when you look at the Israelites, the real question is, what has to happen in order to turn this small family into a nation? What has to happen to get them to leave a place that has initially made them very prosperous? The things that happened in the generation of those patriarchs provides a blueprint, provides a way of seeing those things that are coming, because is there really anything any new under the sun? No. It's all happened in various ways with a lot of similar patterns before. Exodus, it opens up with the phrase, "Now these are the names of Bnei Israel who came into Egypt with Jacob, each man with his family." And when you look at that in the Hebrew, hopefully y'all can see that. This first letter here is called what? It's a Vav, isn't it? Right? And how is that usually translated? Anybody know? It's usually translated "and," right? Any of you English people out there, grammar people out there, are you supposed to start a book with the word "and"? No. All right? It messes everything up. But, "and these are the names." It's a good way to start in Hebrew. But what it does, by starting with "and," is that it connects the book of Exodus back to what has come before it. It's a conjunction. It joins phrases. It joins the ideas together. So Exodus is not supposed to be a standalone or separate book, but a continuation of the previous. And it starts with that summary of the family. The souls that came out of the line of Jacob numbered 70 in all, while Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, as did all his brothers and all that generation. Yet Bnei Yisrael were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. So this one family that started with a number that represents the nations, the number 70, the number of the nations in Genesis 10, the number of the sacrifices offered during the Feast of Tabernacles, also called the Feast of Ingathering or the Feast of the Nations. The one family was sown by God into the fertile land of the nations, sown into Egypt, and it was allowed to grow. They were allowed to grow. The seed that was scattered in Joseph and that generation died. And what happens when a seed falls to the earth and dies? It becomes fruitful, exceedingly fruitful. And Israel became fruitful. And in many ways, they outgrew where they had been planted. Have y'all ever seen that happen out in your garden or in flower beds or things like that, where you put something in there and then in the next couple of years it's like taking over the entire thing and it's spilling out into other places? That's essentially what's happening here. They outgrew where they were planted, and their success, their skills, their wisdom, their knowledge made them move out into other parts of Egypt, made them a hot commodity in many ways. And they were actually more successful than the native Egyptians who grew up there. They went to places that only Egyptians were supposed to go and be prosperous. They mixed in with them, and as always happens, many of them began to take on the culture that was there in Egypt. You need to remember that in Joseph's days, when he was there, when he was interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, and they were talking about the 7 years of abundance and the 7 years of famine, what happened to the Egyptians? First the Egyptians, they used up all of their money, and it became essentially worthless. Then they began to sell things, right? They sold their land, their animals, and they eventually did what? They eventually sold themselves and became slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt. So the Egyptians themselves became slaves of their government. Need to do what I usually do and hit that. But that did not happen to Jacob. That did not happen to his family, because while they were over there in Goshen, Joseph promised that I'm going to supply everything that you need. I am going to take care of you while you're over there in Goshen. So did they have to sell everything in order to get food? No. Did they have to sell their animals, their property, or anything else like that? No. They didn't have to sell themselves either. So while the Egyptians were losing everything, the Hebrews, the family of Jacob, was successful, was favored, was blessed, was provided for. And I have no doubt, well, what do you think? Do you think the Egyptians kind of resented these newcomers who had everything provided for them? I bet they did. They resented the fact that they were given special treatment. And these Hebrews, they were already detestable to the Egyptians, as we were reading about in all of that stuff, is that especially because they were shepherds, they raised the animals, and so the Egyptians wanted nothing to do with them. But after the events of Joseph, where Joseph was raised up to prominence and his family was spared the worst of the drought's losses, that resentment, that division between Egyptian and Hebrew would have only increased. But in many ways, this kind of hostility, this kind of division, this is how a family can become a nation. This is what happens when nations are born. Because what happens to Israel, a lot of people try to compare it to what happens during a pregnancy. You know, at first there's a lot of room and everything is pretty comfortable, but eventually what happens during a pregnancy, some of you ladies will have to explain it better than me because I haven't quite experienced that. It gets a little uncomfortable, doesn't it? Yes, just a little bit. Eventually it gets a little crowded. And there's only one way out, because the child is not supposed to stay in there forever. Amen? Amen. But the process of getting the child out is not always an easy one. It's not always a pleasant one. It can even be painful for one to both of them. But it has to happen. It has to happen that way. The baby cannot stay in there forever. Otherwise, there's no room for growth, and all growth will stop. There's eventually death. That process, sometimes when it gets going, it may start slow, but it starts to accelerate. For Israel, when you see how a nation can be born, it started with a change of a national leadership, and it changed pretty quickly. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Look, the people of Bnei Israel are too numerous and too powerful for us.'" A new political leader who disregarded the past, was disregarding the contributions of Joseph and his family, how they was not considerate of how they saved and rebuilt the nation, didn't know, didn't care. Didn't recognize the God of Joseph, the one God that revealed the meaning of the dream to the previous administration, so to speak. Right? Can things change quickly when national leadership, when political leadership changes? Yes. It can change for good, it can change for bad. When you look at the Aramaic, what's called the Targums, we talked about some of those last week, it says that not only did he not know or acknowledge Joseph, but that he no longer walked in his laws. The things, the system, the pattern, the rules, the laws that Joseph had set up. All those things, all those decisions that helped Egypt survive and prosper, that were friendly toward the family of Jacob, that honored his God. Now, we're not going to do that stuff anymore. I'm sure they kept the 20%. Yeah, it's hard for whenever there's something wrong going on in the world, whenever there's a crisis where everybody struggles and begins to diminish, the one thing that's going to keep growing is the government. So yeah, I'm sure they kept the 20%. But all of those things were done away with. Just like all of those that we hear about and read about and see today that reject our own history, especially that Christian history of this nation. No, we're not going to walk in those things anymore. We're not going to govern with those ways anymore. We're not going to base our laws on those things anymore. And in fact, that's actually a strategy that many courts and judges take these days. When they have a case brought before them, when they are examining a law, whether it's constitutional or not, if it's a law that was made or instituted on some kind of biblical principle or biblical verse or concept, and there's not some secular motivation or something else that they can attach it to, then those laws get struck down. There's a lot of judges that take that pattern. God and His ways, God and His blessings. This Pharaoh didn't know and didn't want to know. And when a government, when a leadership starts thinking and acting like that, it's not going to go well for the people that live under them. See, he no longer considered Joseph and his family allies, but he started to see them as a threat. They are too numerous. They are more numerous. Some of the translations will say that there were more Israelites down there than there were native Egyptians at this point. And they are too powerful for us. So whoever this Pharaoh was, he was becoming a minority in Egypt compared to the Israelites. They were too powerful, too great. They could take over if they were so inclined. And so Pharaoh's strategy was to weaken and diminish them economically, and even reduce their numbers. He says in verse 10, "Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or else they will grow even more numerous, so that if war breaks out, they may join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land." They're afraid of what might happen. When he talks about dealing shrewdly with them, it's with wisdom, as some of your translations may say, but it's a type of wisdom that's not based on God or His laws or His ways. And deal shrewdly carries with it the idea that they're not even going to realize that it's happening to them at first. It will be something slow and something steady, something couched in language that at first seems favorable. At first, they don't really necessarily have an objection to. In other words, Israel's not going to notice what's happening until it's too late. Do people still take that approach and that strategy? Sure they do. This Pharaoh wants to reduce their power. He wants to reduce their wealth. He wants to reduce their numbers. And what's so amazing about this statement is that Pharaoh actually recognizes his dependence upon them. Because, see, he's afraid that they're going to join the enemies. But what he would really prefer is that they stay with him. Because if they stayed with him, then he would be able to fight off any type of enemy. Yes, he's afraid of them, but he doesn't want them to actually leave. He doesn't want them to actually escape the land. He actually wants them to stay, but be so diminished that he doesn't have to worry about this other stuff. He wants to subjugate them. He wants to steal their prosperity. He wants to reduce their numbers and eventually wipe away their threat. Essentially trying to steal the blessing that is there for them. And it's so much like the accuser, our enemy, who comes to do what? He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. That's exactly what he's doing here to the Israelites. It says in verse 11, "So they set slave masters over them to afflict them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as storage cities for Pharaoh." That word, here, slave master, is also, someone will say, taskmaster. It actually has a greater connection to those who exact tribute or forced unpaid labor, who are taking money from them taking wealth from them, essentially forcing the Israelites to build these cities for the public good, for Pharaoh, for the government. They were working essentially unpaid to do the work that the government had them to do. It's akin to taxes, it's akin to wealth distribution, redistribution. They're taking, remember, the Israelites had been done very well during the days of the drought and what followed. Think about it like this. Have you all ever heard of Tax Freedom Day? You all know what that is? Think about it like this. If you started sending, you get a paycheck every week or every couple of weeks or whatever it is. If you started sending 100% of your paycheck to the government starting on January 1st, then they start thinking, how many days would you have to work before you actually got to keep any of it for yourself? That's called Tax Freedom Day. So back in 1915, Tax Freedom Day, on average, was January 22nd. So the tax rate at that point would have to be pretty low, right? They wouldn't have to be paying and working for the government for very long. But it gets worse from there, doesn't it? The worst that I found, that I saw, was May 22nd in the year 2000, where you were working, can you imagine working without getting paid, essentially, until May 22nd? Have they adjusted the laws in such a way that we don't even notice that's what's happening? Yeah. What do they do that? What do they call that? They call that withholding, right? You don't actually even get to see what you have earned, and they've already taken what's theirs. And that's just federal. So right now, as of 2023, the expectation, unless things change, which I believe they probably already are, the expectation is that it will be somewhere around mid-April. Think about it like this. It says, in January, you work to pay off your federal income taxes. February goes toward paying Social Security, Medicare, and other payroll taxes, as well as state income taxes, which we might actually be off the hook on that. In March, you start paying your state, local, and excise taxes as property taxes. And so for the first days of April, you actually work to start paying motor vehicle taxes, license taxes, severance taxes, estate taxes. Right? You are working as the equivalent, thinking about it like this, as unpaid labor until April. Your labor belongs to them for that period of time, but again, we don't notice it. We don't think about it that way, and they're dealing quite shrewdly with us, aren't they? They are reducing and redistributing our wealth. And if they're already doing that, just wait until they start wanting to reduce our numbers. Oh, wait a second. Are they already doing that? Should we be concerned? We need to remember, as Israel does, we need to remember that the Egyptians had lost everything while the Israelites didn't. Now they're wanting to get it back. And so rather than letting the Israelites continue being successful entrepreneurs, they began to force them to build Pithom and Ramses, these public cities for Pharaoh. The Targums describe them like this. They said they builded, get that right, walled cities to become Pharaoh's treasure palaces. That's how the Targums, the Aramaic translations, describe them. They called them Pharaoh's treasure palaces. Where's he getting all that treasure? From them. And the names of the places that are in the Targums is Tanis and Pilusin. I'm probably saying that wrong. I don't think I have that up here. Nope. But does anybody recognize the name Tanis? Yes, but there's a very significant movie from our youth that used that name. If you remember Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they are at the very beginning of the movie, when they're talking about where the ark was taken and hidden, and they find that room with all the snakes and stuff in it, all that fun stuff, guess what that city was called? It's Tanis. So there's that idea. But what Pharaoh intended when he was intending to slow or weaken the Israelites actually made his problem worse. You know, it says in chapter 1, verse 12, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and the more they spread. So the Egyptians dreaded the presence of Bnei Israel, and they worked them harshly. Some of them will say tyrannized by force, and made their lives bitter with hard labor, with mortar and brick, doing all sorts of work in the fields. In all their labors they worked them with cruelty. So they're no longer serving as they said when they arrived, right? When they first showed up there, they told Pharaoh, like, hey, we are shepherds, right? We take care of the animals. And Pharaoh even gave all of his herds over to them to care for. Are they getting to do that anymore? No, not nearly as much anyway. They're making them do all sorts of things. But none of his plan worked to reduce them in number. The more they afflicted, the more they multiplied. Somehow or another, these Israelites weren't getting the hint of what Pharaoh was trying to do. And they were acting so shrewdly that the Israelites didn't even catch everything that he was doing, that how they were getting weaker. In other words, the great thing about when the enemy comes after his people is that the blessing and presence of God, who had promised to go with Jacob and his family down into Egypt, is that more powerful than Pharaoh? More powerful than anything that the enemy throws at us? Can we still be successful as the people of God, even when the enemy is throwing stuff at us? Yes, we can. See, Egypt is a picture of not just the nations and what the world wants to do. It's also a picture of the kingdom of darkness and the powers that rule it. They are jealous of, they are in fear of God's people, in fear of those who are living for Him and who are living by His ways, and they actually want to subdue, to curtail, to suppress them. And that's why, as you know, when you read in Colossians chapter 1, it says one of those depictions of why we need to be rescued from the kingdom of darkness and delivered into where? Delivered into the kingdom of the Son that He loves. But the problem is, as long as we are so comfortable, you know, as long as we are so successful out there in Egypt, out there in the world, out there in essentially the kingdom of darkness, why would we ever want to go? Why would we ever want to leave? Why would we want to change? Why go anywhere else if things are so easy for us? The baby in the womb really only starts thinking about something changing and getting out when those contractions start, when those birth pangs start. You know, what starts out as, you know, as financial pressure, you'll work without pay or on public projects, these heavier taxes, this stolen wealth, things that can be tolerated to a degree. Minor contractions moves to heavier things, heavier contractions, targeting even the children. This is where it will always go. The enemy will begin to target the children. And we're not seeing anything like that, are we, in our day? Right? If only. They will target the weakest and the most vulnerable. So in verse 15, he says, moreover, the king of Egypt spoke to these Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, and said, when you help the Hebrew women during childbirth, look at the sex, and if it's a son, then kill him, but if it's a daughter, she may live. He was targeting potential toxic masculinity or something else like that. But the good thing that was going for Pharaoh that makes him a whole lot smarter than we are today, at least Pharaoh knew the difference between a boy and a girl, a male and a female, and he knew what they were at birth. They weren't guessing. Nowadays, the strategy has changed a little, but we're a lot dumber than he was. Now our culture is encouraged to kill both male and female through abortion. And now our culture can't tell the difference between boys and girls, or don't want us to. They say we're just guessing, the doctors are just guessing, and we'll figure it all out later. And if the babies do live in our day, now our Pharaoh essentially wants to turn the boys into girls and the girls into boys. After all, when you think about it, a boy who thinks he's a girl can never have any children, thus reducing the number. And a girl who thinks she's a boy will not be as significant of a threat militarily. So the tactics of the enemy may be trying different things and different slants but they're essentially doing the same thing that they did all the way back there. The tactics of the enemy have not really changed. The enemy is still targeting our children, so they will not be as inclined or as able to fulfill God's purpose and design for their lives. The enemy fears what our children can become. And so we have to resist the devil. We have to resist his goals. In order to do that, in order to resist the devil, what do we have to do according to James? We have to submit to God first. Submit yourself to the Lord, then you resist the devil, and then what happens? He is the one who does the fleeing. We submit ourselves to God and his purposes. In other words, what the enemy wants to do, what the world wants, we need to understand the ways of Egypt is the opposite of what God wants. For a nation, for a kingdom, for the people of God to truly grow, for us to truly prosper, to truly fulfill God's purposes, we essentially need to understand that doing the opposite of what the culture is telling us to do is a good thing. Doing the opposite of what they are encouraging us is a good thing. So when you think about, does Egypt or does God want our kids to delay or reject marriage? Is that God or is that Egypt? That's Egypt. Does God or does Egypt want us to delay or not have any children? Again, that's Egypt. That's what our culture is saying to our young ones. Does God or does Egypt want us to make our work meaningless and not have any impact or significance for the kingdom of God? Build these random things that don't matter. And who wants us to give our income to an unworthy entity or purpose? Again, that's the ways of the world. When you look at this, we need to understand that the tactics of the enemy have not changed. And he's still trying to pull the same thing off in our generation. And when we realize that he is working shrewdly, we need to understand and resist what he's trying to do, what he's trying to convince us of. But what's interesting in the Jewish understanding of things is the reason why Pharaoh targets these children. Again, I'm going to look at the Targum, the Aramaic translation, gives us some additional commentary that at least shows how they explained it. And in doing so, they actually make a whole lot of parallels between Moses and Messiah. All of those understandings of Moses and Messiah increase. It says in this Targum Jonathan, it says, "And Pharaoh told that he, being asleep, had seen in his dream, and behold, all the land of Mitzrayim," that's Egypt, "was placed in one scale of a balance, and a lamb, the young of a sheep, was ill the other scale." I'll say this is not my translation. and the scale with the lamb in it overweighed. Forthwith he sent and called all the magicians of Mizraim and imparted to them his dream. And immediately Jannes and Jambres, the chief of the magicians, opened their mouth and answered Pharaoh, a certain child is about to be born in the congregation of Israel, by whose hand will be destruction to all the land of Mizraim, of Egypt. Now, isn't that interesting? Another Pharaoh had a dream. And this time, it was a dream about a special son that was going to be born to Israel. And he was going to be greater than all of Egypt. And in their mind, we've got to put a stop to that. That's what Pharaoh was thinking. And again, as we talked about earlier, it's not very much different from Herod. When he heard about the newborn king from the Magi, and he says, well, hey, you guys go down there and find him, then come back and tell me, and I can come back and worship him. Right? But when they went back on their own way, when they had been warned not to go back and tell him, he ended up targeting all the boys in Bethlehem 2 years old and under. There's parallels. See, the enemy wants to stop the prophecy of his defeat and his destruction. And if he can wipe out the Jewish people, wipe out the Israelites, he'll do it. And the children that are born today, the generation that we are raising, do they have a place and a part in the future that God is trying to bring about? Are they important? Yes, we don't realize or know how important they are. Does God know who they are? Yes, He does. So every single one of them is important. And He's going to try to take out as many of them as He can. When you look at that, it says Jannes and Jambres. Do those names seem familiar? So, if they do seem familiar, they should, if you're reading your Bible. It's because those two are mentioned by the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy. When he is talking about what happens in the last days, and when he starts talking about false teachers and what's going on. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 8, he says, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, those were the Egyptians, the Egyptian magicians, so do these people oppose the truth. Again, nothing has changed. Men corrupted in mind and worthless concerning the faith, but these people will not make any more progress, for their folly, like that of Jannes and Jambres, will be obvious to everyone. One of our biggest problems today when it comes to false teachers and false teaching is that their folly is not obvious anymore. It's supposed to be obvious to God's people that they are opposing the things of God. It's supposed to be, but it's sadly not. Far too many don't know the Scriptures well enough to recognize false and unbiblical teaching, whether it's on TV, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's in books. Too many teachers today, do they still oppose Moses? Yeah. They oppose Moses and his role in the lives of the people of God. And they don't even recognize the folly of ignoring what Moses wrote and ignore what he wrote about the way of life that's laid out in the Torah, not realizing that Moses even wrote about Yeshua, according to John chapter 5. And so that everything that we read in the Torah reveals the character and the nature and the life of Messiah so that we can know Him and recognize Him. That's what the Scriptures say. So it's no wonder that the enemy opposes Moses and wants to oppose Moses in our lives. Again, he hasn't changed much. So how do we as God's people resist this agenda against us? How do we continue to grow? How do we continue to increase in power and in influence and in numbers? Well, again, we do a lot like what these ladies did, these Hebrew midwives did. We fear God more than any government. And we live his ways, even if that is contrary to Pharaoh's word. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 17, it says, they were told to kill the Hebrew boys, and they said, yet the midwives feared God. So they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the boys live. That's what it might take. That's what it should take. That's what it will take among God's people. Now, it's ironic that essentially the most powerful man on the planet has his will thwarted not by a powerful military or great numbers, but by two women who didn't lift a single weapon. But we need to understand that if we're talking about a nation that is born, it has to be one that is born of great conviction. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Could that have cost them everything? Yeah, it sure could have. And a nation that is to be born not only has to be born of great conviction, but it has to be a successful one will be based the same way, fearing God and his ways, not rejecting them. And that's really, when you think about history, that's really the biggest difference between the American and French revolutions. They happened about the same time period. One of them embraced God and the Scriptures at least as a basis for law and government, while the other, the French, rejected God and the Scriptures. And theirs failed very quickly. It got ugly extremely quickly. Ours will only last any longer so long as we embrace God and his word. Our nation, if we abandon God and his word, what happens to us? The more that we abandon God, the more that we abandon his word, increases our failure, increases everything that's coming our way. What's interesting about these ladies, these midwives, there's a couple of different traditions that come along with them. Some in Jewish thought think that these two were actually Egyptian women, that they were God-fearers, which is a term talked about with people who are coming into the faith, who join themselves to Israel and are part of that group that essentially, when all the plagues start coming, and there are those people in Egypt that when Moses announces a plague coming on the cattle, and if you don't, you should bring your cattle in. They're the ones that actually start doing it among the Egyptians. Some of them do. They're the ones that put the blood over their doorposts. They're the ones that go out with Egypt when they leave. But those Aramaic translations, the Targums, actually identify them by name. And it's quite a pair, if this is accurate, if this is genuine. It says, therefore did Pharaoh, king of Mitzrayim, give counsel to the Jewish midwives, the names of one of whom was Shiphrah, who is Jochebed, and the name of the other was Puvah, who is Miriam, her daughter. Jochebed is actually the name of Moses' mother. We see that in Exodus chapter 6. It says, Amram married Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, and Amram lived 137 years. So if that's accurate, then those two midwives were Miriam and Moses' mother. Miriam, his sister, and his mother. But that's also kind of consistent with the blessing that comes to these midwives after they oppose Pharaoh's order. It says, so the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let these boys live? And the midwives told Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're like the animals, or they give birth before the midwife even comes to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied, growing very numerous. Again, they thwarted the word and the order of Pharaoh because the midwives feared God, and he gave them families of their own. So even though Pharaoh's will or the enemy's will can be thwarted for a time, he will strive all the harder to accomplish his goal, to kill the children or to kill this child that he was told would be coming. So whether the midwives were Egyptians who sided against him or fellow Jews who did not betray their own, Pharaoh soon figured out that this isn't working with these two. And then he got everybody involved in persecuting God's people. It escalated from just a few to the masses. The same type of pattern that we would see in Germany later. But it says, but Pharaoh charged which of his people? All of them. All of the people were charged, saying, you are to cast every son that is born into the river, but let every daughter live. And there was, by this time, so much rhetoric, so much resentment, so much other things, that they were finding them out. And I remember in some of the studies or some of the patterns of Exodus type of programs, when they were looking at the graves, if I remember this correctly, because I didn't think to look at this, but they had found, archaeologically, a lot of graves and mass graves or groups, and they were finding that the majority of the graves at the time were female, and that there were not any adult males being buried with them. But he made everybody participate in this. And it's into this kind of world where the people of God are targeted, where they are persecuted, that God moves. When all hope is seeming to be lost, he moves and he sends his deliverance. It was only when things had gotten this bad that the heart for God was really beginning to awake in his people, because they were even starting to ask for his salvation, because they had become too comfortable before. So even though they had prospered in Egypt in good times and they had been having some more bad, they had to go through all of these hardships, all of these contractions, to be ready to be led out of the nations. Chapter 2, it says, it came about over the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died. Bnei Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they began to cry out. And their cry from slavery went up to God. And God heard their sobbing and remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the children of Israel, Bnei Israel, and he was concerned about them. He remembered his covenant and the role that he had agreed to. He remembered the promises that he had made. And to save them, God sent this deliverer. He sent a redeemer. Moses was born under those circumstances. He was hidden, and he was raised up even in Pharaoh's house by his own daughter. And the child that was mentioned in the dream grew up right under his nose. And according to Josephus, Moses was raised up. He actually became a very successful Egyptian military general. He would lead campaigns into southern Egypt. He ended up marrying an Ethiopian, a Cushite woman, who was criticized for doing that later in Numbers chapter 12. But all of these things are happening under this hardship and this difficulty. And there's a reason why Yeshua is called a prophet like unto Moses, why he's called essentially a second redeemer. So the life of Moses in many ways mirrors what happens to faith in the life of Yeshua, and to faith in Yeshua even. He was born to a Jewish woman in a Jewish setting. He was raised and grown out among the nations, right? Where has the faith in Messiah done most of its growth? Out. Not in Israel, but out among the nations. Oftentimes, faith in Yeshua, like Moses, was not recognized by other. Moses was not recognized by other Jews as when he tries to lead them, when he tries to save them. He says, he was told, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" But Yeshua was not recognized either. And he also must be called. He must be transformed, in essence, to be sent back at the right time as the Redeemer. just like what we see in a lot of places today. You know, Moses needed Aaron to come and speak for him, right? He needed Aaron to come and be his mouthpiece. Well, oftentimes, in order for Yeshua to be successful and the message shared successfully among Jewish people, they need a Jewish person to do this talking in their own language in many ways. They'll be treated with suspicion and doubt, as Moses was, just like Yeshua will be and is. And in a lot of ways, when we are truly returning back to the call and the people and the kingdom that He has called us to be, in many ways we're going to have to oppose the same culture that raised us. Just like He had to turn against that. I forgot I had these. Born to a Jewish woman in a Jewish setting, not recognized, sent back at the right time. He needs a Jewish brother to help speak for him, will be treated with suspicion, have to oppose the same culture. See, Moses could not come to the Israelites as their redeemer and still look like, act like, think like, and talk like an Egyptian. That identity, that disguise had to be cast aside, just like Joseph had to cast it aside before his brothers. Moses had to become a shepherd for 40 years to become something that Jacob and his children would recognize. Something that Jacob and his children actually were when they first came into Egypt in the first place, but had lost once they had spread out of Goshen. Moses had to embrace something his previous life, the Egyptian culture, found unsavory and detestable. The life of a shepherd, a life just like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in order to become the nation that God wanted, the kingdom, the people of God that He wanted, they had to reject and be willing to leave the things of Egypt and embrace the ways of life of their fathers. Again, nothing has really changed. We are still being called to the mountain where God identifies Himself that way. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. We have to know and believe that despite all of our hardship, in spite of all of our difficulty, the persecutions that may be coming, that God has not abandoned us, His people, or broken any promise. And that will help us in the days ahead. It says, Adonai said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their slave masters, and for I know their pains. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land into a good and large land, a land flowing with milk and honey. He is going to save His people. We always have to hold on to that truth and that reality, even if He doesn't do it the way we would expect. We have to understand who God is. We have to understand that He is going to operate on His terms, and He is not going to be controlled. He's not going to be manipulated into doing what we would like Him to do. And that is actually the nature of His name. When Moses asked for it, when God, he's who should I tell them has sent me? God answered Moses, I am who I am. And then He said, you are to say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And we sometimes fight over the wrong things in our day. This is not really trying to get us to know exactly the correct way to pronounce the name, because none of us can speak with authority on the matter. But we need to know and understand what it reveals about Him. That He is not going to change who He is, or do what is contrary to His character, or bend Himself to our wants and our desires, because He is the King and we are the subjects. The nation that He is building is not going to be a democracy. It's not going to be a republic. He does not and will not govern by a poll. nor will he seek our counsel. And we as his people need to understand that. Because, this is important. Because in those ancient cultures, to know the name of your God meant that you could control your God and invoke your God to do what you wanted him to do. Invoke his name in your spells, your incantations that would obligate their power to do what you wanted them to do. But our God is not like that. And even if we know his name, even if we speak his name correctly, if we pray in the name of Yeshua or Jesus' name, we will never control or manipulate him to do anything that is contrary to his will. There's a lot of people that misunderstand that. But he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is the same God for us in Messiah Yeshua that he was for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, no matter how much time has passed. He says also to Moses, you are to say to Bnei Israel, Adonai, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. And this is my name forever, and the name by which I should be remembered from generation to generation. It's his character, his nature. It's who he is. He is not an angry or vengeful God in the Old Testament and then a loving, graceful God in the New. He is the same. And we are entering the time when, as the birth pangs are accelerating in our day, we need to know that he will be with us in all of our hardships. That he will allow these hardships to grow and strengthen his people, as well as cause us to call out to him for deliverance, to seek out his Redeemer, to seek out Messiah Yeshua, to create that hunger and thirst for his coming. And then we will be gathered to him at his mountain, shown how to live, will be ready to be his people. And our family may start out small. Our family made up of Jew and Gentile will become a great nation. Again, chapter 3. You are to say to Bnei Israel, Adonai, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is who we are supposed to be. This is the God we are supposed to serve. It's the kind of way that he builds a nation and a people. So in the days ahead, when we see all these different things happening, we need to trust in this reality.